All right, in this chapter, the what can go wrong section, although it's always an important section, and I don't always do them in the videos, you should always be reading them. But in this chapter, the what can go wrong is actually a major part of this chapter, because what can go wrong has names and titles. All of these different things could go wrong. So it's not really just sort of at the end of the chapter and a little add-on. This is an actually important section. Bias. You need to know what bias is. And pretty much bias is whenever a sample statistic does not accurately represent, or you could even write the word estimate there, when it does not accurately estimate the population parameter or accurately represent the population parameter. Bias can occur in many ways. It is the bane of sampling and surveying. It is the one thing above all else to avoid. You are always trying to avoid bias. The ways we avoid bias are by sampling properly, making sure we use a random sampling techniques, making sure our survey asks the right questions, how bias can occur. And these are all of our different types of bias. And some of y'all get some of these mixed up and confused, so make sure you're really trying to focus on these. All right, voluntary response bias. When individuals are asked to volunteer to be in a sample, that is called voluntary response bias. That's never a good technique. This happens at Mooresville all the time, where they just come on the announcement and they say, hey, complete this survey and learn. And only the people who really want to complete it actually go and complete it. That's voluntary response bias. It is never a good sampling technique. You hear things like this from radio stations, where a radio station might ask listeners to call in and vote on their favorite song, or call in and give their opinion on something. Only the people potentially who have strong feelings, negative or positive, it doesn't matter which direction, but only the people who really feel strong enough to take the time and go make the phone call are going to potentially be the ones who volunteer. Either way, the sample is not ever representative, and the statistic found from the sample is always going to be biased. So you never want to do voluntary response bias when you're trying to collect data to make inferences about your population. All right, next we have undercoverage bias. Undercoverage when some portion of the population is either over or underrepresented in the sample. So for some reason, your sampling technique, for whatever reason, produced undercoverage. One way you can get undercoverage is something called convenience sampling. Convenience sampling is when you just stand outside a building and you just ask the first 10 people who enter the building. Those 10 people might all be the early birds, and maybe they all feel the same way about whatever you're asking. So the non-early birds are not represented. That's undercoverage. Convenience sampling individuals because they are convenient. This is always a bad idea. Your sample, although it could be representative, we really don't know because we didn't use any type of randomization. So we say convenient samples suffer from undercoverage. Many samples suffer from undercoverage bias, such as phone surveys. Can you think how? So phone surveys are just when they call you to ask you how you feel about something. And the problem with phone surveys is, where do they get the phone numbers from? So they might have a list of phone numbers. But what about the people who don't have phones? Now, nowadays, you might feel like everyone has a phone, and that might be a much more valid statement. But years ago, we got phone numbers, actual landline phone numbers, from phone books. But you had a whole slew of people who weren't in the phone book. So those people were not represented potentially. So you had undercoverage bias. You also, if your phone surveys were during the day, then you're possibly leaving out people who work during the day and can't answer their phone. So your sample suffers from undercoverage bias. So it's just things to think about. Non-response bias occurs when an individual is selected to be in a sample but does not give a response. So this is when I employ a good sampling technique kind of like our dorms, okay? And we randomly select Sue from the girl dorm floor to be in our sample. And so we contact Sue, we reach out to Sue, we say, Sue, please complete this survey. You were selected to be in our sample, but Sue says, you know what, I don't feel like doing that, and never returns the survey. That's called So the people who were randomly selected to be in the sample but then don't respond, well then we're missing out on that person, and that person could have represented some group that we needed, and so we're losing that. It might sound like it's under coverage, and it is in a way, but it's how that bias occurred, and it occurred from a selected person not responding. So those who don't respond may differ in some way than those who do. And that's what a lot of y'all get confused, because you think it's under coverage because that group is not represented. But under coverage is kind of when your sampling technique does not pick up on all the different groups. Non-response is when you randomly selected, your sampling technique is fine, but a person who was chosen didn't respond. And then response bias. Response bias occurs when anything in the survey design influences the response. So this is when you kind of have a question that's leading, all right? Like a leading question would be something like, if I wanted to know about how the food is, or something like if they're going to change the food, say, are you in favor of changing the food in the cafeteria even though you know it's going to cost you more? That's kind of leading the even though you know it's going to cost you more. People might be like, ooh, I don't want to pay more, and they might say, no, I'm not in favor. And that's not an accurate opinion of how they maybe feel. So you want to leave extra words and things like that out if they're not necessary. All right, here's an example. Mr. Royal would like to estimate the percent of students who skip at least one class at least once a week. To do this, he takes a simple random sample of all students from Mooresville High School. He calls these 50 students down to his office one at a time, and he sits straight in front of them and he says, do you skip at least one class at least once a week? Name and describe the type of bias present. So what you have here is a student sitting in front of the principal, and the principal saying, do you skip class? What do you think the student's going to say? Student is probably going to lie, is what's going to happen. That is response bias. When anything is influencing the student, and what's influencing the student here is that the principal is sitting in the office asking the student face to face, do you do this negative behavior that could potentially get you in trouble? That's the response bias. So the response bias, because the students are likely to not tell the truth. Make sure you kind of understand what would result from the bias as well. Would it overestimate or underestimate the proportion of students who skip? And this would actually underestimate the true proportion who skip. Because you might have skippers in this 50 that would count towards this proportion, but if they lie and say they don't, then you're going to have a whole sample of kids who say, oh no, I don't skip, and the proportion who do skip is going to get underestimated. All right, there is no way to recover from bias. If you have bias present in your sample, in your survey, or anywhere, you're just done. You cannot take that data and fix it somehow. You have to start over from scratch. So this is a big deal in the real world. If you are a statistician for a company and they ask you to collect data or do something and you have bias, you've basically wasted your time, your money, and your resources. Your boss is not going to be very happy with you if you have to start over. So this is the one thing. In fact, they have entire college careers just on sampling techniques and survey techniques and how to ensure that they are correct, like professional pollsters and things like that. So this one chapter has like whole careers out there. It's really kind of interesting. An important first step in sampling, in surveying, is spending your time and resources reducing bias. We always are trying to make sure we don't have bias. Please make sure you read through the What Have We Learned in the AP Tips. And that's chapter 12.